Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. So today in the Tim Burton table build, we're going to talk about how to cut this piece of onyx that fits on the top here and how to create the frame that was underneath it that sits atop the tapered octagon that pierces the table. For doing the cuts in this cap, the onyx that I put on top of the tapered octagon, mostly I needed to kind of extract it out of this larger piece that I got. This was actually a dumpster dive catch that I got from a friend's granite shop, but dealing with this large piece on the wet bandsaw, it's just too cumbersome. So what I wanted to do is kind of extract the piece that was going to be big enough, locate the part, mark it all out with a wax pencil, and then after that I used an angle grinder with a diamond blade on it. Now, if you haven't done anything with a diamond blade on an angle grinder, you're going to have some fun with this. It can also be kind of scary at first when you're powering up this tool and dumping it into some water onto a rock. So I just use this 4.5-inch angle grinder. You get a diamond blade. These things seem to last forever. I've been using this one for years on different tiling jobs. So for some reason they last forever if you keep them wet. So you'll see in the video that I kind of set myself up out in the middle of the driveway because it's going to splash all over the place. And you need to just keep the stone wet. So just dump a little bit of water on there just to make sure that wherever the cut is, you have some water in the cut, keeping the blade wet. If you do that, you'll be fine. These tools are all double insulated, so if for some reason some water goes in there and it goes to set off a breaker, it's going to cut the power between you and the wall. So you're not going to have to worry about a shock hazard with this. Doesn't mean dunk it in the water, but you're going to be safe with that. So just keep that in mind. Now when it comes to doing the cuts on the wet bandsaw, if you saw the review I did of this Gryphon, one of the things I mentioned is that it's sort of awkward to deal with, say, some grease marker lines on the stone. So what I opted to do instead was I traced the shape of what I needed onto the slab that I had cut out of this larger slab, and then I just put blue tape basically everywhere there would be a line if I were to draw out the lines. And then I used a marking knife to cut that tape exactly along the edge of the part that I was trying to match this stone to. So the tape made a very clean defining line where I needed to make the cut. So that worked out a lot better than using fat grease pencil lines, especially since you're not going to get it right on the mark where you're at. It's a whole lot easier to do. Granted, you're going to have to sharpen your marking knife after. Now the straight cuts are easy to do. Just push it along, follow. There's a little bit of a tracking and drift issues you got to deal with simply because, especially in a piece of stock like this, that there's considerable density differences. The white seems very, very soft by comparison to the black that's down here. And you really notice it as you're pushing through where the blade will start to want to track against some of the density gradient lines. Whereas if you're cutting something like glass or some homogeneous tile, it's not going to be an issue. Now, as a commenter wrote on the Gryphon review, it would actually be easier to do cuts like this using a regular tile saw because you're going to be able to cut straight. Just make some simple straight cuts. It's designed for making straight cuts. It would go a little bit faster than tracking with a bandsaw, especially if you don't have this bandsaw. So certainly this could be just as easily done on a very inexpensive tile saw, but I wanted to get a feel for this saw. Now the straight cuts were easy to do, just tracking them along, but when it came to the bevel cuts, what I opted to do is I simply cut the angle that I needed on a piece of 2x4, which would just be this first part, then you take the offcut and you roll it over and that becomes the rest of the ramp. And then I would just hot melt glue this piece on wherever I needed to apply the bevel. This way here, the straight cut that would go down would form the bevel that I needed. Now the tape trick I used as well for marking the top part of the cut, so it made it a little bit easier to track to the top and not worry about the bottom so much. So that whole thing, the tape making lines, was a great, great way of doing all this. Now at the end you're going to have something that's got some rough cuts. So what I use there is you can get some honing stones at a tile shop like this. It's just a natural rub stone. So tile installers will use this when they cut natural stone in the field for doing some shaping, and then they'll shape it down. Of course, this was just perfect for basically straight honing the edges. All you got to do is make sure you keep everything wet. Now for the last part, I used the Rotex 125 along with some Diamat sheets. Now what Diamat sheets are, these are foamy little sheets. They're very similar to Platen, except Platen, or Platine, I don't know how they want to pronounce it, has a different abrasive. It uses just an aluminum oxide abrasive, so it won't last quite as long. It's not quite as durable against a harder substance like this, whereas this is industrial diamond impregnated. So these work really well. Get them wet first, so definitely get some water on there. And then after that, it was pretty easy to use to basically get everything to the point of being nice and polished. So I went up from 500 grit up to 4,000 grit with Diamat on here, and basically it was a really beautiful polish when I was all done. So then lastly, after the Diamat, I just applied some Brie wax. This is Brie wax granite and marble polishing wax, so it's actually a really hard wax. You put that on there, and then I just used the felt pads along with the RO125 so that basically the friction, you'll see it's just pushing around this heavy wax, and once you build up enough of the friction, everything just smooths out to a glass smooth finish. So that really made for a really nice shiny piece. So it's really not all that hard to incorporate a piece like this, especially you can get scrap like this from any granite shop. So now we need to make a frame for this. So let's get over to the Jointmaker Pro. So before we head over to the Jointmaker, I need to make the stock that we're going to be cutting as the frame for the bottom of this shaped piece of onyx. Now what I chose to do is I wanted to have basically a bead that stuck up all the way around this, kind of that, it's an angular frame, yet the edge of the frame is all round. So it kind of acts as a little bit of a contrast to all the other angles that are in this project. This is a Bridge City multiplane, has a number of different profiles, and this is my favorite one. So the profile itself is like just a half turn, but it's got very, very small shoulders on it so that you can actually put it onto a corner. So planing this part is going to be a two-part process. I'm going to be planing it this way onto the stock, and then effectively planing it this way on the stock. So that's actually why I ended up doing a little bit on the bench and a little bit on the Moxon vise. So let's go ahead and go through this. So far what you can see is one side of the bead is starting to form where the shoulder is. Now one thing that's interesting about a profile like this is that the blade is shaped as a half round. The top of it is sharp as well, so it's not like you can keep going until it stops. It'll keep on going as long as you want to go. So normally after I get the pattern started like this, I'll take a fat pencil and just kind of draw a line along the middle of the top. Mostly what I want to do is I want to keep going until the pass just removes that line. That way there, I know I've cut everything. There's no flat on there. Sure, you can hold this up to a raking light and make sure there's no flat, but this is a whole lot faster. So for finishing the round, we just put it in the Moxon vise so we can crank this up a little bit. Same thing though, take a pencil, make sure you know when you're done. So you can see that the profile is pretty much done now. I'd like to do just a little bit more cleanup, and actually that's a little bit easier with the fence removed. So now at this point what I would have done is I took the table saw to basically make a cut underneath here. There's a small lip that you can see here that I've colored in black. So with the table saw blade set correctly, I can completely remove that, like so. And then with the bandsaw, I would remove this entire back square section so that I have just a bead sitting on top of a flat of wood. So now what if you don't have an HP6 with this profile in order to make a bead like this and it was something that you actually wanted? Of course, there's always the option, choose something else. Now this is a V-grooving bit that has some straight sides on it. There are some that actually have curved sides, so you can get them in different radii. You can make one straight run on this side to create basically this shoulder. You'd be also rounding this other side, which makes it different, but you don't really care about that because we're actually cutting that off with the table saw. Then you could run an 1/8 inch roundover bit on this side. Then you take the stock this way and run an 1/8 inch roundover on this side here to finish off, 3/4 of the turn, and then go back to the round V-grooving bit to do one right down in the middle there to kind of finish it all off. And then you can always use like one of these little finger sanders like I used in the video for doing some of the finessing when I was doing the joints and they just didn't quite, if you could feel a difference, I used this, and it just helps you blend everything in and feather it all in. So assuming we have our stock, I want to show how I created the frame for this. I took basically the stone, I put the stone on there, traced around it with a pencil, and then afterwards I was using a couple layout tools for coming up with different angles that I then transposed onto the Jointmaker. Now the two layout tools I used you probably don't have, and they're really hard to find now because they were made by Bridge City over 2 decades ago and they haven't been made since. But I'm going to show you how you can do all this work without having to use any of these layout tools. This is just something nice if you happen to have them. So like this one here is the commemorative tool number 4. It was an angle divider. Basically you're using it like a bevel To set an angle, you're just going to widen that out until you've matched an existing angle, and then this center rule in the middle that comes off the straight blade divides the angle. So, whether you're on this side of it or this side of it, the resulting angle is going to be a bisection of the angle formed by the outer two arms. When I would set this up for an angle, let's say we're doing one of these angles here that's actually on this paper. So if I did that angle there, then I can use this other transfer bevel, which is the same thing as this, just doesn't have the centerpiece in it. And then I can just place it inside, widen it out till it hits that center arm, lock it, and now this bevel is set to the bisection of this larger one. But these tools aren't ones that you can get very easily unless you go and you troll on eBay and try finding them, poaching them at 4 in the morning. So what the result of this was, though, was to basically get a transfer bevel like this that I could then carry over to the joint maker, and then I could set the fences so that the blade of the joint maker was along one of the arms while the fence was on the other one. So that way there, I could basically miter all the pieces to match exactly what I needed for the frame. Didn't matter what these angles were. I was measuring them off exactly what the part was, and that's how I could make some very nice clean miters. So how do we do this if we don't have, the fancy CT4? There it gets back to some geometry classes you've long forgotten, but let's go over it really quickly. So on a new sheet, let me go ahead and trace the stone. Now for the sake of this demo, I'm going to take this angle here and I'm going to find the bisection. First, let's do it the way I did it in the video using the CT4. So I'll place this on here, place it on its lines on both sides, like that. Then I can use this other transfer bevel, place it on the inside, widen it out until it matches the angle that's on the inside of that CT4. There's my bisection. So if I want to, I can go ahead and I could draw this. But instead, first we're going to go ahead and do it with some geometry. So we're just going to set this up, put it on the point, and then just strike a line with the compass to make an intersection point on the two lines forming that angle. So these are equidistant. We actually didn't even care what this setting is, just pick something that's kind of convenient. Now what we want to do is we want to draw two other intersection points. So you can keep the compass at the same setting, but you don't have to. So in fact, just because of that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change this. I'm going to widen it out a little bit. And what we're looking for is we're looking for where the curves from the two strikes are going to intersect. So let me put this here on this intersection, draw a curve, and not move. There's our intersection point. Now we can draw a line through the intersection of those two curves and then through the point of the angle that we were trying to bisect. And there's our bisection line. So now we can see how we did compared to this other beveled gauge. Put this on that outside line, move it right up to the red. It's basically a perfect match of what we had before. So now with that, I set the fence on the joint maker in order to make the cut. Now one thing to take into account when you're using this stock though, is that the edge of the Onyx is going to be on the inside edge of that bead. So, I don't have this cut away yet, otherwise you would know it goes right up to the edge of that bead. So you have to make sure that when you're taking measurements off this paper, these measurements here, which are the edges of this stone, that has to be on the inside of the bead. So that's actually where you're going to make a mark of where the cut has to go, and then make sure you line up the cut on that mark. So you don't have a mark on all the way to the outside, and you don't have one all the way to the inside. You're going to have to kind of just eyeball that with the blade. And it turns out it's actually pretty easy to do. When the blade is up, you can sight right down it, and you see that it goes right through the spot. Make the cut. You'd be surprised how accurate you can be. Now, the joint maker does a lot of different things. This is actually kind of a very simple, trivial use of the joint maker. So how could you do this if you didn't have a joint maker? It's actually not really difficult. So let's go to the other bench and see how to do it. So now with my bevel gauge set to the angle I want to cut this molding at, how am I going to accomplish that cut using just my bench? Now, certainly you could pop this onto a table saw, but then really setting these bevel cuts with a miter gauge is kind of awkward. It takes a little bit of time. And if you have a fragile molding, you're going to run the risk of it actually doing some tear out on the bottom of the cut, which, depending on how you have to do the cut, may be bad for your project. So this is a really simple way of doing it, and doesn't take any longer, probably even is faster. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to treat the front of this bench as if it was where the blade is located. Now when I was adjusting the fence on the joint maker, I placed one edge of the bevel on the blade and the other edge was where I placed the fence. So let's try doing that. I place the bevel up against the front of the bench, then that's where I'm going to be needing the fence. So I'm going to use just a simple scrap of wood that's got a nice jointed edge on it as my fence. Push this over, get myself some clamping room. I'll just take a piece of MDF, I'll just slap this up against here so I can make sure that that bevel gauge is actually flush to the front. So you do that, and then you press this fence board up against the bevel. Now that's where it's located. Now we can clamp that in place. So now I can place my stock up against this fence, and then as long as I have a blade here, that's where I'm going to be making the cut. What we're going to use is just a flush trim saw. So we can put this upside down, take a look at the blade so we can see exactly where we're cutting, and you could scoot this over until you got it in the right place. Now, I actually like to clamp this down when I make the cuts because of the way I want to use my finger to hold the blade. So now just place the flush trim saw up against the bench and start making your cut. And just like that, we've matched the angle. And it makes for a very nice clean cut with this flush saw because you can kind of go up a little bit higher in one part or the other to make sure that you don't get any blowout along the way. Now, one thing you want to make sure of is that the front of your bench is square to the top, so just give that a little look. Now, the rest of the build was pretty easy. All I did is I used some stretchy packing tape to stretch and stick the pieces together with just the tape. Then I was using just some veneer pieces to glue them down across the joints to build up the frame. Now, in my case, I used an offcut of the Tapered Octagon because that happened to be a very thin piece and it's already had the angles in it, so it was kind of convenient. But you could use any type of veneer. I was actually planning on using some that I've been using for my Angle Madness project. Now, in my case, when I was putting the stone on the top, it didn't really matter if the stone was up by 7/1000ths of an inch or whatever the thickness was of that veneer. So it was all right for me. But if in your project you can't have something on top, what you can do is you can stretch the tape on the bottom and then you open it up, the joint, spread glue over the joint, then close it up, wipe away the glue, and then just let it set. You'd be surprised how strong that can be. So in my case, since I was gluing it down to the top of the Tapered Octagon, you could actually do it kind of the opposite way. You could stretch the tape along the top on the inside part, then bend it, open it up, put the glue on the joint, close it back up, then when everything is solid, you glue the whole thing down with the tape on it, down onto the Tapered Octagon. Then you'd have a lot of reinforcement so you could peel off the tape and not worry about it taking your project apart. But we'll talk about that more in the assembly video. But between now and then, we have to make some legs. So the next video is going to be about how I design the legs and then shape the legs. So we'll catch you then.